Hello, welcome to this webinar. This webinar is being put on by the IChemE Safety Centre, and it's actually for the New Zealand member event that was meant to be taking place in Auckland this evening. So thank you all for joining me. My name is Trish Kerin and I'm the Director of the IChemE Safety Centre. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started on the webinar today. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can actually type them into the question panel that you have where you've logged in. And then I will be able to see those and actually address those questions at that point. If you just want to make a general chat or a comment to anybody, then you also have a chat function. I will take a look at the chat function as well if you happen to put a question in there, but if we could try and get all the questions into the questions panel, that would be really, really helpful. We're recording this webinar so that it will be then made available for others to see at a later date should they wish. So without any further ado, I will get started on the webinar, and this one is entitled Taming the Wild River Rapids, How Process Safety Can Apply Outside the Process Industries. And what I'm going to go through today is the story of what actually occurred at Dreamworld on the Gold Coast in Australia on the Thunder River Rapids ride. So firstly, to set the scene for you, on the 25th of October in 2016, there was a pump failure on the Thunder River Rapids ride. That caused the water level on that ride to drop. An empty raft that was on the circuit then became stuck at the conveyor system. Sometime after that, about 57 seconds, a following raft with 6 passengers in it collided with that stuck empty raft. The raft with the 6 passengers in it then flipped up, fatally injuring 4 of the passengers in that raft at that point. So here's a graphic to sort of show you how we've got the stuck raft on the right-hand side and the other raft following along behind it. You can then see that basically it started to nudge against the stuck raft. That caused it to flip upwards, as I said, resulting in fatalities of 4 of the people within that raft. There was 2 children on that raft that did actually survive the incident. So now, when we want to talk about process safety, it's really important that we think about the different aspects of process safety and how they apply. Primarily, we have leadership as a key requirement in process safety, but that leadership needs to be exercised across knowledge and competence, engineering and design, systems and procedures, assurance, human factors, and culture. And we're going to go through each of these areas because each of these areas had a part to play in this particular incident at a theme park, which we might think is not at all related to process safety, but I think you'll see when we see the issues that occurred, how they can be related back to process safety and for our own facilities. So if we look at knowledge and competence first, there was a significant lack of training for the operators that were operating that ride. It was informal at best to be trained on that ride, and it lasted for about 90 minutes. The operator that was operating the ride that day as the junior operator, it was actually her first day on that ride. She was an experienced ride operator, but she'd never processed and operated that ride, which was said to be one of the most complex ones within the whole facility. She stated in the coronial inquest that she, quote, showed me the front page of the manual and just flipped through it. I had to go through it myself. She said, just sign off on it when you are happy. So I think you'll all agree that that is not a comprehensive strategy for training someone, particularly on a complex system. She was not trained on the use of the emergency stop, and in actual fact was told to, quote, don't worry about it, you don't need to use it. Now, this is particularly disturbing because there was almost a minute from when the first raft became stuck to when that raft could have actually had the ride could have had the emergency stop hit, which could have then prevented this incident occurring, for example. She also then said, though, that she would have waited for the senior operator to tell her to hit the emergency stop rather than actually taking the initiative to do it herself. So this is a little bit akin to the idea of the stop work authority. She didn't feel that she had the right or the ability to hit the shutdown button in the case of an emergency, and that's really quite concerning. There's also an interesting part that's now come out that the coronial report's been released around the engineering qualifications of the engineering team. Now, a number of the people working at the facility within the engineering department were not actually qualified engineers. Queensland, the state in Australia where this ride is, does have a requirement for engineers to be registered in that state to work unsupervised. Dreamworld did not have a single registered professional engineer in Queensland on their facility or their payroll. And some of the people within the engineering department, whilst they were very experienced tradespeople and had worked their way up, they actually hadn't studied the processes that we learn in engineering. So it's not to say that engineers are better than tradespeople, they're not. We all bring different things to the table. Engineering degrees and training provide us with very different ways of thinking and applying problem-solving techniques, and they didn't have those present at that facility. So if we think about your facilities, how effective and comprehensive is your facility training? Do your operators fully understand how to safely operate the facility and what to do in the event of an emergency? Do they understand the hazards of all of the equipment on site as well? If we now think about engineering and design, there's 6 key areas to take a look at in this particular process. The first one we're going to talk about is the timber slats. Then we're going to move on to the pump, the low water mark, the emergency stop system, the maintenance system, the seat belts, and then lastly a new one that has also become apparent since going through the coronial report, risk assessments at the facility. Okay, the timber slats. So firstly, if we look at the ride itself, and this is a photo of the actual ride in Queensland, you can see that there are some timber slats that run across the conveyor belt system, but they seem to be quite far spaced apart, and it looks like there used to at some point be another 2 slats between every slat on this particular ride. And there actually did used to be another 2 slats between every slat. This is what a similar sort of ride looks like in Florida. And you'll actually see there that the slats are very, very close together. Now, the purpose for the timber slats is twofold. One, it actually provides a safe barrier between a human and the mechanism of the conveyor below. So the reason that that barrier is there is that if someone fell out of a raft, they actually would be protected from falling into the raft conveyor system. The second reason is that it also ensured that the ride rafts themselves don't get trapped in those gaps and lead to them flipping over, which is tragically what we saw happen in this particular incident. No one actually knows when the timber slats were removed, or indeed why the timber slats were removed. So this clearly shows there was a complete lack of management of change processes employed at this facility. So that's a significant issue, that there's actually no engineering records or risk assessments to let us know when or why those timber slats were removed. If we look at the pump that was running the water system through this water ride, there are actually 2 pumps operating as a pair, and they were having a lot of trouble keeping the pumps running. That actually tripped out 3 times in the days leading up to the incident, and twice already that morning of the actual incident. Now, the cause of the tripping was not thoroughly investigated. The pumps were just reset so the ride could continue operating. They had called in the maintenance technician from the pump maintenance people to come and have a look at the pumps, and they were actually due on site a couple of days after this event. So they weren't able to come out any earlier than that. They were booked to come in the following week. There was also a lack of indication that the pumps had tripped. There was no alarm system to actually tell the operators that the pumps on this water ride had stopped functioning. So that then led to them not being able to understand how whether the pumps were actually running, because there was no alarms, no indication whatsoever. This leads us on to the low water mark. The only way the operator could actually tell if the pumps were running was if the water remained at a particular level in the channel. So the channel here in this photo is completely empty, and they used to judge the water level by the scum level on the side of the channel, rather than looking at an alarm system or anything like that. A recommendation was made a couple of years ago that a safety-rated detection and shutdown system should have been installed on the pump, so that if the pump tripped out, the conveyor should stop. That would have cost about $2,200 to install, but unfortunately it was rejected as not being necessary and was never installed. So we had operators trying to figure out if a pump was running on the basis of a scum line in a channel with moving and flowing water through it. From the emergency stop perspective, there was a recommendation in a previous audit that the emergency stop system should be simplified. And this was rejected on the basis that the risk was acceptable as it was and it didn't need to be rectified. What was even more concerning here, though, was that the emergency stop was in a very poor location. It was a very difficult part of the ride to get to, but there were actually 2 emergency stops, and they did 2 different things. One stopped the conveyor system in about 7 seconds, and the other one stopped the conveyor system in about 2 seconds, so they actually performed a different function. Even a senior operator at that particular ride was surprised to know that the 2-second shutdown actually even existed in the first place. From the maintenance perspective, well, we've all seen the situations where maintenance spending gets cut because we run out of money. And that was precisely what had happened here. Maintenance spending had been cut 7 months earlier because they'd already spent their entire year's budget. Now, in the coronial report, they are stating that urgent maintenance was still being conducted as required, but basically nothing unnecessary was being done. A maintainer, when interviewed, stated that he did perform regular checks on the ride itself. However, the regulator stated that the ride was in generally poor condition. The ride was shut annually for overhaul, but the maintenance planner said that they actually never saw an engineer inspect it on the 9 occasions that they witnessed the shutdown. So we need to think about whether we're actually doing the right level of maintenance on our facilities, especially at this current time where not only do we potentially have financial constraints based on commodity pricing, but we also have resourcing constraints based on potential lack of availability of personnel, and this can be really quite a concerning thing that could occur. So we do need to think about how we will continue to resource maintenance of our facilities as they keep running. And if we do shut them down, then how do we actually make sure we do the right maintenance before we start them back up again? The seat belts. So this is a little bit of a contentious issue. There is some argument as to not having seat belts on a water ride in case a raft flips, like it did, and potentially traps someone underwater in a seatbelt. There was actually an incident after this particular incident occurred at a ride park in the United Kingdom called Drayton Manor, where a child fell from a raft because there were no seatbelts installed. The child actually stood up to swap seats with their friend, and when they did, the raft hit a rapid and they tumbled out and they subsequently died. So what they ended up doing at the Thunder River Rapids ride before this incident occurred, they had started to use Velcro-based seatbelts. So you would sit in the raft and you would put your 2 pieces of Velcro together to hold you in place. There's 2 issues with using Velcro for a seatbelt. Firstly, when you overuse Velcro, it loses its adhesiveness. It starts to hold less than it used to when it was brand new and fresh. So straight away, if you use Velcro as an enormous number of times, you will start to wear out its adhesive capability. And secondly, if you take Velcro and you make it wet, its adhesive capability is even less because it just really doesn't hold in water at all. So effectively, the Thunder River Rapids had seat belts that did not work in an incident when they were needed. Other rides of a similar nature have mechanical aircraft type lift the clasp buckles. They definitely hold. and they can be easily disconnected in an emergency if necessary. So the seatbelt issue here is particularly tragic. The coronial inquest has actually found that had the seatbelts actually held, at least one of the fatalities would not have occurred. So that's even more tragic than I think other parts of this incident, that for want of a proper seatbelt, someone might have lived in this particular incident. Another thing that's also become apparent within the coronial report that's been released is that there was no evidence that risk assessments had ever been conducted on the ride in any sort of proactive manner. So this is a complex piece of machinery that has a whole lot of moving parts and control systems that members of the public who have no skills or knowledge of ride on quite happily, and no one had ever done a proper risk assessment of what could go wrong and how that needed to be managed and what controls needed to be put in place. The reactive assessment after an incident, they did do some, but they weren't communicated to anybody. And this ride had had other incidents, and I'll talk about those in a moment. So from your facility perspective, how robust is your management of change process? How reliable is the equipment that you have? Is it shutting down, and what are you doing about understanding why if it is? Do your operators have the right instrumentation to be able to safely run the plant? Do you understand how to safely shut down the plant if you need to in an emergency? Are your maintenance regimes correct, and do you have competent maintainers doing them? Do you have the right PPE that you're going to hold when you need for an incident? So how do you respond? What's your equivalent of a seatbelt, and is it the right piece of equipment? And have you performed a thorough risk assessment on your operating sites, on your different units, on your different processes, to really understand in depth what is going on in that particular process? The systems and procedures area. So I mentioned there were similar incidents. In fact, there was one in 2001 where an empty raft actually flipped over. Now, there was nobody in that raft. They did an investigation, though it was a fairly poor level investigation, and determined that the chance of a repeat with passengers was, quote, is nil. So they actually wrote off this whole idea that this incident could ever happen again with passengers in it. Yet tragically, in 2016, that is precisely what we saw 15 years after this incident. There was a number of other incidents that had also occurred on that ride. It was not an incident-free ride by any means. By far, though, this particular 2001 incident was the most concerning and aligned to what occurred that day in 2016. The senior engineer at the site believed that the incident that occurred that killed 4 people was actually caused because the operators just didn't follow the procedures. And I'll actually show you a quote a little bit later on of when he actually said that and what he meant by it. There were also no emergency drills conducted before the incident had occurred on how to respond to something like this and how to rescue people out of the ride. No one quite knew how to respond at that particular point in time. No one was sure what to do. And certainly in the year following, there was still no evidence of routine emergency drills being conducted on some of their other rides either. So the question is, how thorough are your incident investigations? Are they really getting to the root cause and telling you what you need to know and what you need to do to fix it? Is your system resilient to procedural deviation? As humans, we will make mistakes. We will have a problem, we'll make an error. That error should not lead to a catastrophic outcome. Our processes, our systems need to be resilient against that. Do you have regular emergency drills and then evaluate their effectiveness for learning and implement that back into your process as well? If we look at the assurance area, there were many third-party audits and inspections performed on this particular ride as required legally. The 3 years earlier, one had recommended simplifying to one emergency stop.
but that was not done because it was not deemed necessary. In 2016, the ride was actually given an extension by the regulator because the park could not find a competent person to inspect it. There were requirements under the law as to what a competent person is, and they were having trouble finding someone that would be willing to certify as a competent person. They did eventually find an inspector, and he approved the ride 3 weeks before this incident. However, the legislation also clearly determined what checks needed to be performed by that competent person. And one of those checks was to check the logbook, the daily logbook for the ride. That was not checked. We know that was not checked because there wasn't a logbook for the ride. So that inspector signed off without completing the legally required checks. He did it on the basis that people told him that they were checking the ride every day, they just weren't writing it down. And that then really comes back to this idea that if it's not written down, it never happened. You cannot believe that something occurred if it wasn't written down. You also need to have systems to make sure that if it is written down, that's because it did occur and not just because someone wrote it down as well. So how thorough are your audits and inspections? How are recommendations managed and addressed in your organisation, particularly when they're rejected? On what basis are they rejected? And are all of your required regulatory audits or inspections carried out in the necessary time frame to the required standard as well? The human factors in this particular incident was even more concerning. So first of all, from a human interface perspective, we had a very confusing control panel and emergency stop set up with 2 different emergency stops, and no one actually understood how they worked or what they did. Additionally, the operator was required to perform 36 checks per minute. Now, these ranged from safety checks, such as making sure people had their Velcro seatbelts on, to customer service, remembering to smile and say hello and wish them a good trip on the river. 36 checks per minute. If anybody can actually manage 36 things per minute every minute, I'd probably suggest you're not human, you're superhuman at that point in time. So we clearly have a human factors set up here, which is just setting people up to not be able to succeed, showing a complete lack of understanding of human factors by the organisation in operating this ride. I mentioned the engineer, the senior engineer, that said it was basically the operators didn't follow procedures. Now, this was actually a statement he made during the coronial inquest. In my view, if procedures are followed, the system is a safe system. You may as well not open the park. Procedures are there to be followed. If we don't follow procedures in everyday life, things happen. What concerns me most about this statement is that that wasn't made in the heat of the moment of the incident. That was actually made with many months to reflect on it. And it really does show a lack of human factors understanding in the organisation. As I said, if lack of following a procedure leads to a catastrophic outcome, then we have not designed a system that is resilient enough to actually do what we need it to do. So from your perspective in your facilities, how much load is being placed on your operators? Are your procedures simple to follow? Do you have engineered safety systems, or are you relying on administrative controls only and hoping that people don't make a mistake? And the culture in the organisation. There was definitely a culture of new rides being prioritised over the maintenance of existing rides. And we see this all over the place. It's always far more interesting to work on the brand new piece of equipment than it is to work on the old rusty piece of equipment down the back of the plant that we really don't want to be involved with, because we want to be involved with the new, fun, exciting stuff. We need to resist that temptation, because the older rusting stuff down the back of the plant may be critical. It may be able to cause a significant incident for us. And it needs even more love and attention as it ages and is subjected to more use, more potential corrosion, or whatever other impact you could have on that particular piece of equipment. So it's really important that we don't prioritise the new parts of our plant over routine maintenance of the existing parts of our plant. There was also a culture of fear amongst the operators. They actually spoke about being scared to go to the toilet, because that meant that they might have to shut the ride down, and there was pressure to keep the ride running because it was one of the most popular rides in the whole park. So when the customers were in the park, they weren't happy when that ride wasn't operating. So they were not drinking any water during their shift while operating the ride. In the hot Queensland summer, for example, where dehydration becomes a very significant issue, which can then impair cognitive ability, which is very concerning. So there was this genuine lack of fear and lack of ability to be able to speak up. There was also a complete lack of learning from incidents. As we've seen, they said in 2001, 15 years before this incident, that the chances of this happening again were nil. But there was no justification of why it was nil. There were several other incidents that had occurred, but the learnings were not publicised or communicated to anybody in the park that could make use of that particular learning and information. They didn't have an effective incident tracking system at all, and this statement was made by their safety manager. They were unable to track incidents as they were reported, investigated and closed out. And regarding safety, he also actually said everyone thought it was someone else's responsibility. So no one was actually taking accountability or responsibility for safety at the facility, because everyone thought it belonged to someone else. So how much focus is aging plant getting versus new plant at your facility? Do your people feel safe to report an issue? And we talk a lot about the ability to say, we need to stop work. If you think it's unsafe, stop work. Well, let me challenge you to think about what happened the last time someone did that. Did they actually get thanked for intervening? Or was it a little bit of a punishment? Did they roll their eyes? Oh, again, he's always complaining. What treatment did that person get? Because that will actually tell you a lot about the culture and a lot about whether anybody's ever going to report or intervene again in the future. How are your learnings captured and shared to the people that need to know in your organisation? And lastly, if I was to walk into your facility and ask any random person in there who's accountable for safety in your facility, what would they tell me? So if we think about leadership throughout this whole area, in the weeks following the incident, the company elected to still hold their annual general meeting. Now, there were legal requirements that they did actually have to hold their AGM. They're a listed company on the stock exchange. There are legal requirements to do this. However, I think this is quite damning of the overall leadership when at that particular AGM, they awarded the Chief Executive Officer a bonus for the previous year's performance. And it was a bonus of about $250,000, I think, from memory. They didn't think that perhaps that was not a wise thing to do. Following, 3 weeks ago, 4 people had been tragically killed at their park. So I think this really showed a complete lack of awareness of leadership and what actually occurred. It took a few days, and the chief executive eventually decided to hand the bonus back and have it donated to a trust for the victims' families, which was the right thing to do, but in actual fact, it should have been done before the bonus was announced from a leadership and a reputational perspective as well. Also, in the media, the chief executive made comments about how she had reached out and contacted the victims' families. However, it didn't take very long for the victims' families to appear on media and say, no, she hasn't. We haven't heard from her. She hasn't reached out to us at all. Leadership in a crisis is a particularly challenging thing, but you don't get to make up the facts in that instance. So what had actually occurred was she had reached out to the police about engaging with the families, and the police had said, no, not at the moment. Now, if she had have said she'd reached out to the police and was advised at this particular point in time it wasn't the right time, that would have been okay. But she actually said, I'd reached out to the families, and she hadn't. So it was a poorly worded statement that made her look disingenuous and dishonest. That didn't help the situation at all that was going on at the time. So from a leadership perspective, actions always speak louder than words. In your roles, whatever you do, wherever you work, you are actually a leader, regardless of your positional authority. What do your actions as a leader actually say at this point in time? And I think that's always an interesting one for us to reflect on. And particularly at the moment, as we go through some very unprecedented times with a lot of concern and fear, uncertainty in what's going on, if we can step up as leaders, now's more than ever the time that we actually do need to step up as leaders. I'm happy to take any questions. I'll give you a couple of minutes to put some questions in. Is the culture similar in other parks? The company that owns Dreamworld owns a couple of other parks around the world. I can't speak to what their culture is like. I have had the opportunity to meet with the head of safety for Disney parks, and certainly my experience in Disney parks and my conversations with the Disney safety people suggest that no, the culture is not similar in other parks. It's actually quite different. I think this was a particularly concerning culture in this particular park. We also need to go back in history a little bit as to when these parks were actually built. They were built in the 80s in Queensland, on the Gold Coast. And at the time, the way that parks were built was basically kind of as cheaply as they possibly could. So they didn't go and commission ride manufacturers to make rides. They went around the world and said, oh, that's a pretty cool ride. Let's draw it up and see if we can go and build it at home. And that is how a lot of the Dreamworld park was actually built originally. Now, they've changed how they do that since, obviously, but there's a lot of things that were sadly put into the system that we're now trying to deal with there. So in terms of, do I find the culture similar, for example, if I go to a Disney park? Not at all. I am very comfortable personally going to a Disney park and riding on Disney rides. I've been on Disney rides when they've shut down for safety reasons, and I can tell you they have a very structured emergency response process to get you off the ride. So I've never felt concern or unsafe in other parks that I have visited. Are parks like this one required by law to provide a safety case or similar? If not, are the authorities planning this? That's a very good question. Thank you for that, Christian. Prior to this event, they weren't required to provide a safety case or similar. Within a few months of this particular incident, in fact, before the coronial report was even released, because it actually took us almost 4 years to get the coronial report released, the Queensland legislation was changed to require safety cases to actually be drafted and written. So they are now focusing on making sure that they have safety rated interlock systems, for example, on some of their rides. So we're seeing a substantial change in how in Queensland rides are being approached to make sure that they do have a safety case. And the major hazards regulator is largely involved in coaching the other regulators responsible for this and the facilities on how to prepare and get through a safety case. So it's a sector that's going through an entire reinvention at the moment. We've got another question here. Why was it hard to find a qualified inspector in Australia? That's a good question, Danielle. I'm not really quite sure. I think it was actually down to people had started to possibly shy away from doing it with the requirement to be registered in Queensland, would be my guess. So from that perspective, it can be hard to find someone that says, yes, I'm a park ride inspector and I'm happy to work in Queensland and I'm registered and certified for it. The inspector was actually registered in Queensland, as I mentioned. Interestingly, the coronial report has made a recommendation to the Board of Professional Engineers in Queensland to deal with that particular engineer in a suitable way. Will the presentation be available on the IChemE site? Will be actually made available on the IChemE Safety Centre YouTube channel, so anyone will be able to access that. So if you just go to YouTube and search for IChemE Safety Centre, you will actually then be able to access all of the previous webinars that the Safety Centre have produced as well. Is this the first foray of the traditional industrial MHF process investigations? Foray out of the traditional? I'm not really sure what you mean there, Stephen. The Safety Centre have done some presentations previously on incidents that have occurred that are definitely not your traditional process safety area, because there's always a lot of interesting learning. In fact, earlier today, I uploaded onto our YouTube channel a webinar about human factors and organisational culture, but I used the example of cave diving to explain the concepts and how they can be applied. So that's another example. We also have one of our case studies in the Safety Centre, which is focused on organisational culture and ethical decision making that revolves around space travel. So there's a whole lot of different sorts of incidents that have occurred that are not traditional process safety, but where there is an enormous amount of process safety learning that we just need to take on board. Another interesting area is I did some work last year, some research into the Royal Commission into the banking sector in Australia that highlighted a lot of misconduct that had occurred in the banking sector. And what struck me in that was that there was some very clear process safety learnings around how organisations apply risk management. And again, there is a short little webinar that actually summarises what was learnt in that instance and how it can be applied to process safety and what some of the parallels to process safety are. So I hope that answers your question, Stephen. Any other questions? Okay, is there a New Zealand regulation in which process safety should be applied to different industries as a rule of thumb? I am not aware that there is in New Zealand. Obviously, New Zealand is going through a very substantial change in its legislative framework as the safety case regime, but also the Work Health and Safety Act and regulations are being embedded, and it's quite a substantial shift to how things were done in New Zealand. So I'm not aware of other specific industries that are picked up, although what I would suggest is some of the requirements under the WHS model law from Australia, which is what New Zealand has effectively implemented, does require the risk approaching thinking in what you actually are doing. So there is definitely some structure in there around what you need to be doing to understand your hazard, assess your risk and implement your controls. But I can't answer whether there is a specific law or requirement for other different types of industries. I think there's a lot of learnings that we can be sharing that could be useful. So I would encourage people to think about how we can look at things more broadly. Shiraz, you're welcome. I'm glad you found it interesting. Any other questions? No, it looks like that might be about it. I hope you did all find that interesting. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in New Zealand with you at the moment. I understand you're in quite a substantial state of lockdown, as I think Australia is probably about to enter that very quickly. I hope you all remain healthy and well, and I look forward to talking to you again. I think you'll see shortly that there'll be a number of other webinars advertised that the Safety Centre will be doing to continue to try and provide valid and good, useful information out to people at this time. We do have one coming up on the 31st of March that you may have received an email about, where I'll be talking about leadership and safety in uncertain times, so very specifically targeted towards how we manage the uncertainty that we're currently living in at this particular point in time. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to speaking to you again on the 31st of March if you tune into that one. Thanks a lot. Bye.